What if I told you that Ferrari found something in Lewis Hamilton's car so serious, so profound, and so dangerous that not only explains his poor performance in Brazil, but could have defined the entire first part of the championship? What you are about to discover will make you see the 2025 Formula One season with different eyes. It all started with a sprint classification in Interlagos that, on the surface, did not have much mystery. Hamilton eliminated in SQ2, Leclerc barely qualifying 8th. But beneath that result was something deeply unusual. Ferrari engineers did not focus on frustration over poor performance, but rather on anomalies in the data. Something didn't add up, neither with the pilot's feelings nor with the simulator's predictions. There was a gap between what the machine promised in theory and what it delivered on the track. That gap was no longer tolerable. Interlagos, with its uneven surface, abrupt elevation changes, and recent resurfacing that introduced new grip variables, became a stress laboratory for engineering. There, the structural weakness of the SF-25 was laid bare. What seemed like a minor balance or setup problem became a clue to something much deeper, a systemic inconsistency which manifested itself with a dangerous and difficult-to-predict irregularity. It was then that the team decided to scrutinize every available data on car number 44. The tires, upon reaching a certain thermal threshold, broke their ideal operating window and began to generate graining or asymmetric loss of grip, forcing Hamilton to adjust his driving style in an unnatural way. When I tried to preserve temperature in the rear axle, I lost grip in the front. When I pressed in a curve to activate the front axle, the rear axle became unstable. The car was never balanced, and the worst thing, this behavior was not constant. It varied with minimal differences in fuel load, atmospheric pressure, asphalt temperature, or even the level of kinetic energy accumulated after an aggressive lap. This situation not only affected pure performance, but something even more critical: pilot confidence. In Formula One, confidence is not a luxury. It's a necessity. And Hamilton, a driver who relies on precise feedback from the rear axle to maximize his late braking and cornering ability, found himself driving blind in many phases of each stint. For a 7-time world champion, used to understanding his car to the millimeter, this was a nightmare. The problem was not just technical, it was psychological. The uncertainty caused Hamilton to hesitate at every corner entry, at every aggressive support, at every moment where he had to fully trust the chassis. And this in a sprint classification where every thousand matters and there is no margin for error became a silent condemnation. The elimination in SQ2 was no accident. It was a direct consequence of a design that was unknowingly boycotting its own ambitions. Therefore, for Ferrari, this race was not just another defeat. It was a revelation. What they discovered in Brazil not only explained the poor performance of the SF-25, explained why the car had never really been in racing since the start of the year. Every setup decision, every attempt to compensate with aerodynamics or compound change was being sabotaged from within by a concept poorly aligned with the dynamic realities of the track. And in that moment, everything changed. Because when you understand the root of your problem, you can finally start to solve it. But you also discover that you had been running for months with a defective car, and no one had noticed. The severity of the discovery at Interlagos not only generated immediate concern for Ferrari's performance that weekend. What was really shocking was that the defect identified was not circumstantial. It was not the product of poor tuning or a specific component failure. It was the symptom of something much deeper and more structural. It was the reflection of a conceptual error carried over from the design of the SF-25 itself. And this is where the internal pressure multiplied, because this bug could not be fixed with a minor update. It was not enough to change a spoiler or introduce a new ground specification. The root of the problem was in the guts of the car, in the structural DNA of SF-25. And worst of all, it had been a collective error validated for months by dozens of engineers, simulators, and prediction tools. Some Maranello engineers began to question whether the obsession with maximizing performance under ideal conditions had blinded the team to the reality of the track. Because the SF-25, as conceived, was a car that worked only under ideal conditions. He had no tolerance for chaos, nor the ability to adapt. It was the opposite of a modern racing car, which must be flexible, robust, malleable in its setup. The 2025 Ferrari was a diva, brilliant in the wind tunnel, but unstable on the real track. This disconnect between theory and practice became even more evident when analyzing what happened every time the car entered a corner at high speed with minimal variation in weight distribution. The rear axle became hypersensitive, and the car went from having neutral behavior to being unpredictably oversteering or understeering depending on the thermal condition of the tire. It was a nightmare for any driver, but especially for one like Hamilton, who needs consistency in the car's reactions to execute his most aggressive maneuvers. Therefore, what seemed like just a design error was actually a philosophical failure. Ferrari had built a car for perfection, in a world where perfection does not exist. They had forgotten that Formula One is a sport of constant adaptation, and that oversight was costing them points, confidence, and the reputation of having given Hamilton a competitive car. The SF-25 wasn't simply slow, it was conceptually fragile, and that's much harder to fix than anything else. After weeks of darkness, uncertainty, and frustration, something changed at Ferrari. The discovery made in Interlagos was not a condemnation, but a turning point. For the first time, the team had a concrete response to the SF-25's erratic behavior. But more importantly, they had an opportunity to redesign not the entire car, but the critical areas that caused this dissonance between theory and reality. And that change, although technical in its nature, was emotional in its impact. The Maranello engineers knew they couldn't redesign the entire car mid-season, but they also knew that there were aspects that could be intervened. The suspension components, the thermal management of the brake system, the modulation of the brake-by-wire system, and above all, the way in which the car interacted with the asphalt from its lower architecture. The result of all this was profound, and it became visible almost immediately. In Austin, the sectors where Hamilton previously lost half a second were now competitive. In Mexico, he managed to extract lap times that just a few weeks before seemed impossible for an SF-25. But beyond the stopwatch, what changed was his body language inside the car. On the onboard cameras, for the first time, it was noticeable that he was pushing again. That accelerated the braking. That he threw the car into a curve knowing that it was going to respond. That kind of trust is invisible in the data, but it changes everything. And this wasn't just a technical relief. It was an emotional rebirth. Because what was at stake was not just Ferrari's competitiveness, but the entire narrative of a 7-time world champion who had taken the riskiest leap of his career to seek one last chance at glory. Hamilton had not been wrong. The car was bad. But now, finally, they were starting to correct it. In every improved lap, in every cleaner sector, there was a quiet recovery underway. Ferrari was rebuilding its identity, and Hamilton was regaining his faith, not only in the project, in itself. And this unexpected turn, a technical improvement that seemed minor but completely transformed the relationship between driver and car, could be, in retrospect, the most decisive moment of the entire season. Not because it guarantees immediate victories, but because for the first time, it gives them a real base from which to start building them. What Ferrari found in Lewis Hamilton's car is not only relevant to understanding what happened in Brazil. What they discovered there completely rewrites the narrative of the 2025 season. Until now, many analysts believe that Ferrari had simply returned to its old habit of losing competitiveness in development, of getting the correlation between simulation and reality wrong. But this time, it wasn't about that. This was a fundamental, technical dissonance between the car and the real world. Now that they have identified it and are beginning to correct it, what is coming is a direct consequence on the competitive order of the grid. And that can completely destabilize the championship. To start, the immediate impact is on trust. And not just that of Hamilton, who for the first time since signing with Ferrari has felt that the car responds to his driving style, but that of the entire team. Because solving a problem of this magnitude in the middle of the season is, in essence, a demonstration of structural maturity that just 2 years ago was unthinkable in Maranello. Is no longer the Ferrari that improvised patch solutions. Now they have a method, they have technical reactivity, and above all, they have a solid foundation on which to build the future performance of the SF-25. But what is truly disruptive is what this means for its rivals. McLaren, Red Bull, and even Mercedes had begun to assume that Ferrari would not be a serious contender this season, and that allowed them to operate with less pressure, with more relaxed development margins. But now, if Ferrari begins to gain consistency on the remaining circuits, if it manages to extend the performance window of the SF-25 thanks to these technical corrections, then everything becomes compact. The championship, which seemed headed for a close fight between Verstappen and Norris, could receive an unexpected new player. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.